Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy, with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon. In Bernard Hickey here, speaking from the Press Gallery, the Spinoff's offices. Thank you very much to the good folks at the Spinoff. Peter, lovely to see you there in Hoon Bay.
Bernard, it's lovely to see you too. And we're going to, you're going to dominate this week because it's right up your alley, because we're going to do a lot of analysis of the budget and how it affects our housing market with bits tacked on. Is that right?
Exactly.
And we're going to allow you to do a soliloquy, I think, quite early on.
That's right. I think it's worth talking about what this budget is and what it isn't.
Yep.
It's been described by Nicola Willis as a going for growth budget.
Yeah, right.
Yep. And also a budget which is responsible and contributes to lower government debt.
I did
in
sort
the
of
future.
see that. Yeah. All right. So we're not going to start the with a soliloquy yet.
Oh, I was just warming up.
Just warming up. Yeah, and is there an element of doubt in your voice there, Bernard?
No. This is a budget which is described as going for growth, but actually has lower growth forecasts than what was put out in December.
I think we need to tackle that, and because it was supposed to be the no BS, but because we're not allowed to say the C word in Parliament anymore, she did not want to say the no bullshit budget. But I think as usual, Bernard, you have the most fantastic bullshit detector in politics, and so we can analyse whether she's really met that. It did seem very calm. So and was it a good day down on how was the lockup?
Yeah, it was subdued, I think. If I was to describe the reaction in the lockup, it was very much meh.
Yeah,
and she says it was the no BS budget, but I'm actually happy to call BS on her no BS budget, because it wasn't a growth budget. It actually revealed a higher debt track, and essentially involves throwing women and pay equity under the bus to get an extra 30 basis points in rate cuts.
Don't do a spoiler alert on your own bloody soliloquy. I noticed that Patrick Smelly, our dear friend, because he sort of went meh, but of course because he had to write 1,000 words on it, he made it slightly less meh. But he said low capital intensity and poor uptake of advanced technology are key reasons for New Zealand's abysmal productivity performance. So this initiative makes sense both as a short-term mood lifter and a medium-term spur to better commercial and economic performance. Maybe is what I would say to that. I reckon this is the ute. I'm going to, because I'm self-employed, I think this is the time for me to get a 20% tax rebate on a new ute, because all freelance journalists need a ute to carry the enormous stories around that they've got. Now, Bernard, we're going to have we're going to devote most of in fact all of the show virtually, other than possibly the skateboarding dog, to the budget. We have pollster Lara Greaves coming on at Grieve, I think it is, coming on at 17:15 at 15 minutes past the hour. We've got tax accountant or tax advisor Terry Boucher coming on at 17:35 to dispense not literally advice. Having listened to Bernard's wonderful 5 from 5 thing with the ANZ, he's always very strict about this not being investment advice. And Craig Rennie from the Council of Trade Unions, and I didn't realise this, on the Labour Council, is on at 17:45. So we're going to do a Bernard soliloquy in a minute. I just wanted to mention a couple of things that are not related to the budget. I went to the Voyager Awards of Media. I wasn't eligible, and oddly this year I wasn't a judge for the first time in a long time. And I was really struck by the Palestinian protesters, or the pro-Palestinian protesters outside. And they were wearing, including a friend of mine and her father. And I was really struck that they were wearing press flak jacket outfits. They weren't literally flak jackets, but I thought that was an incredibly effective and very simple form of protest, particularly at a media event. And then they projected on the wall of the Grand Millennium Hotel images of the journalists who've been killed in Gaza. What I thought was less cool was when I discussed this with a friend of ours who works at NZME. Apparently, the same people, more or less, have been protesting constantly outside NZME about the Herald coverage of Gaza. And I have to say, I think that's unfair because it is very well, there are no international journalists effectively in Gaza. Even Al Jazeera finds it nearly impossible now, particularly after its Gazan reporters were targeted. And I'm not sure that the story clicks for the Herald and so on. I'm just not sure that marking out the Herald or Stuff for that matter for criticism on this is really warranted. But I was really struck by looking at a piece by the Committee to Protect Journalists, which identified 2024, and we're now 5 months into this year, as the worst year ever for journalist deaths, which is pretty extraordinary when you think of the number of wars there haven't been, or when you think of the lack of oppression in places like the Philippines by comparison. There were 124 journalists and media workers killed last year. 70% of them were killed by Israel. So this is a very dark time. And then I was struck today, Bernard, this is not to take you away from the budget. The Israelis overnight in the West Bank fired on, I think, 30 politicians who were visiting from 31 different countries. And the IDF fired at them to supposedly disperse them. And it is, we're talking about, this is a pariah status. Now, some buggers say that I'm taking over your furphy. Right, Bernard, your soliloquy rather, not your furphy. Right, on to the Bernard soliloquy so that we don't intrude on
Lara.
Thank you.
Yes.
Bernard, how did you characterize this budget, Bernard? Can I pull the string on your chest?
Sure.
On your back?
Thank you, Peter. This is the budget that was supposed to be a growth budget, and the budget that was supposed to be a no BS budget, and the budget that was supposed to be a debt reduction budget is actually a budget that has higher debt, lower growth, and has plenty of BS in it. Because when you look at the numbers in today's budget, we are looking at a lower growth track than what was forecast at the end of December. We are looking at an increased borrowing requirement of an extra $8.3 billion. And that's because growth has been slower than the government and Treasury expected. And because their own actions and to be fair, what's happening overseas with the Trump tariffs is lowering the size of GDP and therefore the size of the tax take over the next 3 to 4 years. And so the government is having to pedal faster to chase its own tail to try and catch up. And that's why it has come up with $5.3 billion worth of cost savings. Now, as we discovered in the budget today, $2.7 billion of that, 51%, is coming from the pay equity grab back, which was pushed through Parliament without debate about 10 days ago. And that essentially says the government is paying for tax cuts by cutting future pay growth of carers, of nurses, of people working in schools, and of basically women who can't really afford it. This is also a budget which is making life harder and reducing the disposable incomes for a fair number of young people, with young families, and people who are renters. But at the same time, it is focused solely on doing everything the government can to reduce the mortgage rates by around about 30 basis points.
Really?
So,
How do you, could you explain that? I don't mean to interrupt your soliloquy, but just explain why that will happen, please.
sure. So the government is saying it will reduce the amount of borrowing and it will reduce the amount of debt. And therefore, there is less pressure on interest rates in the government bond markets. And because the government bonds set the base for interest rates in New Zealand, that in theory will mean less demand in the economy and therefore allow the Reserve Bank to have 30 basis points lower interest rates than would otherwise be the case. And so that's, for those people who have mortgages, that's 30 basis points. So that's a third of a percentage point. And that's the net benefit of everything that's being done in this budget over the
Wow.
next 4 years. And
I haven't heard
so
that from anybody else, Bernard. So thank you. That's I think that's a really good insight. Carry on,
yeah.
please.
Now, and the question is, do you think all of this, the pulling the pay equity payments away, the detail in the budget today that nearly $800 million worth of housing funding, operational and capital funding, has been pulled out of Māori housing funds.
Oh,
And
I didn't see
that,
that either. Yeah.
yeah, and that we are seeing various nips and tucks around Best Start, which is a payment for young families, some changes around working for families, and also for young people who are applying for job seeker
Yeah,
allowances.
18 and 19-year-olds are no longer independent from their parents, apparently.
That's right. And so they have to work extra hard to show that their parents don't want them, or vice versa. Their parents will have to tell MSD that they really don't want to help them out. And so, it's making life that little bit harder for young people and those young people who want to save. So the government is cutting the KiwiSaver contribution from the government from $512 to a maximum of $260, and it's being effectively income tested. So if you're earning over $180,000, you don't get anything. And it is one of these budgets that nibbles away, just as nags and nips and tucks at younger people who are unemployed, and is a big hit.
Bludgers, in other words. Is that right?
Yeah.
Bludgers and women?
Young people, yeah.
We
People who-
bludgeon bludgers and women. Is that
Yep.
what's going on here?
Well, that's one way to describe it. But there is a benefit if you are a pensioner over the age of 65 with a gold card. You will get an extra rates rebate. This is something that Winston Peters has managed to score out of the budget. Now, on the other side,
How do they get a rates rebate when councils are independent from the government, from the central government?
yeah, no, it's funded by the central government. So
Oh,
this
I
is,
see. A transfer.
yeah.
A little
Yeah, yeah.
transfer between central and
Yeah.
local. Jesus.
Yeah, so this is a gerontocracy, not so much a democracy, and the gerontocrafication of our political economy continues apace. And this is, another example of where the government is very focused on helping those people who own a home, who have a mortgage, and who are focused on increasing their wealth through their homes. It's not focused
So
on...
it is are you suggesting again that we have a housing market with an economy tacked on?
Exactly. Bits tacked on. It's barely an economy at that. And in terms of being a political economy, it really is a housing market with bits tacked on. And we've seen that again in this budget. And again, the government's actually done things that will reduce future growth in housing supply. And of course, if you are a homeowner or a rental property investor, the last thing you want is an increase in housing supply. So overall, meh, if you're a young person, a renter.
Would you explain what meh actually is? Because I'm not sure whether anybody really remembers it. What meh, M-E-H. It's just like, oh yeah, okay.
Yeah.
But I think you're saying this is actually a bit more serious than I are okay. Because the other thing you haven't fully addressed, Bernard, excellent of you to address the impact on women and on 18 and 19-year-olds and sort of the rest of us. Because I'm not, clearly I'm not ready to take advantage of the super gold card or whatever it is, or the extra super gold card, or the Winston card, as I think.
Oh, I'm only 7 years away.
Well, I know. Well, yeah. Let's not go down that route. But there was this 20% capital investment deduction offered to business. The thing I'm going to buy my ute with, my diesel-powered ute with. That's being asked to do a hell of a lot of work.
Exactly. And it was promoted by Nicola Willis in the lockup as a way to increase investment. And it will increase some investment. And we can tell that because Treasury is forecasting it will cost the government in less corporate tax revenues around $1.7 billion a year. So that means those people like yourself who buy the ute and take 20% of the cost of that ute off their taxable income will get a small improvement or reduction
20%
in their
of the cost of whatever they've invested in. Yeah.
yeah. So essentially, it's a third.
And I noticed that she talked about tradies, and that's the people who buy. I mean, what's it actually for, Bernard? And is it going to offset? I mean, I'm not meaning to let you have interrupt your soliloquy again, but we'll just lib this a bit before Lara gets in. But what's it actually? I mean, you've got 20% investment deduction, which is great if you're a tradie perhaps and you want to expand a little bit. Will it give them the confidence to expand, or will the changes to KiwiSaver and their higher employer contributions offset that?
So we will see a $1.7 billion reduction in revenues from the investment boost. But it will be paid for at least partly in a reduction in the amount that the government is having to pay out in KiwiSaver payments. So there's about half there. So there's
but it's shifting the responsibility to employers, isn't it?
Yes, and also to KiwiSavers themselves. So it's hoping that accidentally people will save more because they haven't opted out of the increase in the default contribution. And employers may be a little bit grumpy, although they will simply just take it as part of the overall compensation package. Lara, lovely to see you.
Hello. You know, Bernard, I'm Peter Bale. I don't think we've had you on before, but we're dying to have you on for the politics of this or the political impact of this. Thank you.
Oh yeah, thank you for having me.
Lovely to see you again, Lara. Thanks very much for coming on and talking about this. As Peter says, we're curious about the politics of this budget. It's described as a going for growth budget, but actually it's reducing the government's impulse into the economy, and it's being paid for effectively by stripping out the benefits of pay equity agreements. About 50% of the spending cuts on this have come from pay equity. How do you think this is going across politically for the government?
I think one thing to really consider is that we have an election next year. I know they come around quite quickly, but we have an election next year, and really what it comes down to in an MMP election is those voters in the middle, those floating voters, those swing voters. There's been various studies that have looked at them. There's somewhere between like 8 and 12% of people, just kind of depends on how you count them. And the real question is what they think of this budget. And I would suspect, given that data from the election study shows that they tend to be more likely to be women, they tend to be more likely to be, say, under 40, that perhaps they wouldn't necessarily look so positively on this budget. If we look at, say, cuts to the KiwiSaver, cuts to the pay equity, ability to make those pay equity claims, some other stuff around, I always call it the wrong thing, that sort of best start, better start, whatever it is.
Best start, yeah.
Yeah. And, if you think about a lot of, say, women in their 20s and 30s will be hoping that they can get that money because that makes having a child just that more affordable. So those are the policies that I've been thinking about in terms of those swing voters, those voters in the middle, and where this budget might land with them. What it's then going to come down to is how Labor kind of sells the opposition, like whether they do really make that pay equity claim really land with those voters, really feel like it's taking away from them in some way, and those various policies, which we saw come straight out of the gate saying this is a kind of anti-woman type budget. So we'll see how that lands.
What about the 18 and 19-year-olds that are going to have to ask their parents to support them, or to talk to the government about why they can't support them? I mean, that seems like a redefinition of when an adult is an adult, and I think we can vote from 18, can't we?
Oh, yes. So it's interesting because we can vote from 18. We don't necessarily vote from 18. So those age groups, of course, are less likely to turn out to vote. And They probably are, like, if we look at the age distribution of voters, I suspect they probably are more likely to go for the Greens anyway. But not all 18-year-olds. But I don't necessarily think that the budget is something that very many teenagers pay a lot of attention to in terms of their voting. Yeah.
Lara, I'm curious about how the framing of the budget by the by the government as, a tightening of the belt of when times are tough, we tighten our belts. We're not spraying confetti around like the opposition.
No lolly scramble.
This is not a lolly scramble. All those sort of political messages. How does that go across with voters? Do they buy into this? The government is just like a household, and we have to tighten our belts, and it's good for us that we're having our money cut.
The hard one, because what always seen in for different election studies is when you ask voters who manages the economy better, generally, even if National are doing poorly, people say National. The one kind of counterfactual to that was around COVID, where people actually for the first time said Labor was better at managing finances, which was, kind of quite an anomaly going back to even since sort of 90s. So generally people do view National as better at managing money. So if the opposition can somehow undermine that kind of idea that National is not managing money well, that's kind of a positive thing for the opposition in that case. Generally, at the moment, we've seen it kind of when the discussion of the cost of living crisis, how National framed up that really successfully. I think Simon Bridges has said that he was the one who came up with that at one point. So the cost of living crisis and framing the cost of living crisis as something that National is now, if you think of the journey of that, first it was the cost of living crisis, and now National are working to try to solve it. That's the kind of narrative I think that they're going for. And say in 2026, I mean, look, I don't have good financial knowledge, good economic knowledge, but say 2026, those indicators have turned around. Maybe some of those international forces are less forceful. Things like interest rates are down, maybe cost of living is better. That if people can turn around in 2026 and say, hey, look, National managed the economy well, then I would suspect they would then reward them with being government again, and perhaps being government again without having to negotiate with these two minor parties, ACT and New Zealand First. So that would be the narrative or the scenario that I think that I would be trying to do if I were National now. But of course, there's a little bit of finger crossing in that because we don't know what 2026 will necessarily bring.
And toes. And Lara, I'm also Bernard will point out about the low growth forecasts actually as well, or the lowered growth forecasts. So this idea of going for growth while also lowering the forecast is quite clever, or not, as the case may be. ACT, all of this money, a huge percentage of the money that has turned this possibly from a super deficit budget into an eventual even budget, comes from the idea from Brooke Van Velden to dive into the settlement of equal pay. David Seymour said today, within about a second of the whole thing coming out, that it's more than ACT would spend, but it's less than other parties would spend without ACT in the government.
I noticed that too. Yeah.
I mean, how's he? Do you detect that he's being successful in playing this way, and looking? He's in the driver's seat from the back seat, is he not?
Well, that's going to be his argument at the next election, because one of the things is this famous paper called Counting the Cost of the Coalition by a couple of great professors that have shown that minor parties in coalition governments in New Zealand generally do not do so well in later elections. We've seen that that's been the general trend. There are exceptions, but the general trend is you're a minor party, you go into government, the next election, you have to differentiate your brand. And you have to really sell what you did as part of that government. You have to really be able to go to voters and say, ACT, we differentiate ourselves from National because it was us, it was the ACT party. We managed to make them spend less than they would otherwise. So he needs to be able to start selling that point. And he's going to be in a really hard position because it's going to be, to the right of National, although they haven't necessarily been in the past, New Zealand First as well. So it's going to be ACT and New Zealand First competing for some of the same voters. So what I think I'm looking for in this next year or so is the way that Winston Peters manages to sell New Zealand First, and David Seymour manages to sell ACT. And I think trying to talk about small government, that spending less, I think that's probably the way that ACT will go, and that's a strategy on his part.
Interesting, Laura. I also was struck, and maybe both you and Bernard can help me answer this or look at this. Is there anything that in a 3-year parliamentary term, she was throwing out to 5 years and balanced budget and so on. Does any New Zealand government that actually, even one that's a coalition and may get a successive term, how does this fit with a 3-year budget term? And I wonder whether can any government act in the long-term interest in New Zealand now? I mean, Bernard always talks about there being a straitjacket around the government from the last from the Douglas era.
I think that's interesting in the fact that we're going to be voting on a 4-year term next election as well. So as part of the Independent Electoral Law Review, and we kind of recommended at the time, it's time for another discussion about this, national discussion about the timeline. And I guess, I'm not a big kind of budgets details type person, but a lot of people have made the argument that we do need that longer term thinking. I mean, I've definitely heard the arguments that long-term cross-partisan agreements would be ideal on things like infrastructure spending. But in terms of just that 3-year timeline, because very few places, I think it's 3 of us in the world that have one House of Parliament and a 3-year term. But the idea is that some people might want to extend it out. The voting population in that referendum might want to vote for a 4-year term because that does create a longer time horizon. My colleagues in law would probably then argue, hey, there's not enough checks and balances, and everyone's going to get their chance to vote on that. But it's there's arguments from the political side of thing. Again, I'm not a finance person, but from the political side of thing, that a 4-year term is better than a 3-year for sort of fiscal planning. Yeah.
And Laura, does your recent polling suggest? Sorry, Bernard, go ahead.
It's all right.
Go ahead. Go
Fine.
ahead. Jesus Christ, that's a severe outtake of breath. Go ahead.
Sorry about that, Peter. Laura, thank you very much for coming on. It's been great to have you. I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to have to bring in Craig Rooney now. He's come to us a bit early, if that's all right.
Thanks so much, Laura.
We really appreciate you jumping on. That's great. Okay.
Thank you for the coverage.
Thank you. Craig, we've got you on a bit earlier than we expected, but that's all right. We love having you on the show. Craig, what did you make of this budget?
I was really surprised by the size of the overall cuts to pay equity. I'm sure everyone else talking to you today will be talking about exactly the same thing. It's essentially, I worked at it, it's $360,000 a day, about $6,000 an hour that's been taken from those workers. I was also surprised by the changes to youth unemployment and the 18 to 19-year-olds.
It's weird, isn't it, Craig?
It's quite bizarre because it's not as if we're not going to pay in some other way for that. So if we're not offering unemployment support, then we may well be offering accommodation support. We may well be offering what we call temporary additional support, because if people's incomes fall below a certain level, we top it up anyway. And there was no clarity as to how that was actually going to be paid for. Who was going to, what was the threshold for which parents were suddenly going to be responsible or not responsible? And if we think about this in other jurisdictions, if you're a student, you have to wait until you're 25 to be an adult to get support. If you want to go away and do something else, you've got to wait until you're 21 or 18. But now the age of freedom from your parents is now 20. So it's quite a strange set of decisions. We also saw, quite a strange set of decisions. If you remember last year, we had a budget that focused on the family boost payment and how much more money was going to go into ECE. We see at this budget, the amounts of new money going into ECE is 0.5%. So it's a cut in ECE funding. We saw cuts in lots of other areas of funding, Māori development, Pacific Island affairs, a range of other areas, but we saw increases in corrections and defence. And I guess that the question for me that I really pose myself is, can you imagine a Jacinda Ardern government looking at the numbers here and saying the child poverty numbers are going all in the wrong direction, that we're seeing increased levels of poverty amongst beneficiaries, and making the same decisions as this budget? as this government has.
Yeah.
No, I can't. But carry on, Bernard, please.
I'm also interested, Craig, in this framing of the budget as an investment budget as well as a growth budget. And there's talk about a slightly increased capital allowance for this year, although it's offset by slightly lower capital allowances in the next 3 or 4 years. How do you see the government's approach here on investment and whether it's enough?
Yeah, well, we certainly look at the capital investment intentions of the budget, and we can see from a couple of years ago, there's approximately in the order of $10 to $11 billion less capital investment than a couple of years ago. And it's not as if the capital investment pressures are going away. So we still know we need to build the schools, the hospitals, the roads. We're just not building at any rate approaching the needs to actually start to cut that investment gap that we know exists. In terms of investment, we're also investing less in making it harder to access skills. Tuition fees at university went up by another 6% this year on the back of 6% last year.
Oh, has he flicked himself onto no sound? What's going on there, Bernard?
I think there's been a recording stop, so that's weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
We can hear you again, Craig. That's good.
No,
I think
Sorry,
we
we just dropped you for a minute there. For a moment
you
there.
just dropped out for a sec there.
So repeat everything you just said in the last 15 seconds, please.
Capital investments, we're seeing less capital intention. We're seeing nowhere near enough to actually replace get close to filling the infrastructure gap that exists, and we are nowhere near to make it easier to actually invest in students. Tuition fees went up by 6% on top of 6% last year, so our human capital investments will be lower. It's a real challenge everywhere. I'm sorry, gents. I have to go because I have to go
to
another place. Apologies. Very happy to
Glad
talk
you
about
got it. We're glad you got into the lockup too.
Thank you.
Thank you
Cheers,
very
Craig.
much. So that was Craig Rennie, and we appreciate grabbing Craig on a very busy day for him and a few other people.
Yeah,
and
I think we're going to have to get you to do another soliloquy towards the end as well, because I think there'll be some sort of a digested soliloquy.
I have no shortages.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
we're very lucky that Terry Boucher has turned up
has he?
to jump on. So let's have a chat with Terry.
Terry, we've got 250 people on, but I'd like you to give me some direct tax advice of my own, please. What the hell am I going to do? Jesus Christ. Yeah. Terry, it's good to see you.
Kia ora, Peter. Bernard, nice to see you too. Right, what tax advice are you? And obviously,
no. I don't want. I'll talk to you about that offline. I'm always amused when Bernard does his 5 minutes with the ANZ in the mornings, and he says this is not investment advice, and so I then immediately go onto Sharesies and buy whatever Bernard's just suggested I do. Terry, I wanted to ask you. Bernard's got big questions about you, but the KiwiSaver change is kind of interesting, and you're a logical person, I think, to ask about the viability, suitability, and sense of KiwiSaver at a time when people aren't saving enough. What they've done today, is that going to reduce the saving rate and therefore make superannuation an even bigger problem in New Zealand?
Very good question. I'll have to preface that by saying I am not a financial advisor.
Yeah.
And but I'll also tell you what I tell my clients. So these two come up, said, this is tax, no question is too stupid. And also, don't ever let the tax tail wag the dog in investment terms. People tend to do that. I just got off, I think these are poor changes.
Mm-hmm.
We have a problem with saving. And I actually don't have too much of an issue of saying, right, anyone earning over $180,000 a year, you're no longer entitled to the KiwiSaver government contribution. Don't have too much of an issue with that, because that's at a level of saving your income there where you ought to be able to manage your savings. I do think what's proposed is much more problematical for the reasons you pointed out, lower down the scale. And that is for people on low income earners, that every dollar that goes in, it's time in saving, time in the market that matters. So the earlier you get the dollar into your books for the saving, the better. And this is, so getting people into good saving habits soon is a good move. And so opening it up to 16 and 17-year-olds is to be actually applauded. But governments around the world have all part of their sort of tripartite sphere: personal savings, superannuation, and public superannuation have all had part of that. They've made a tax break or contribution to private savings accounts all around the world. It differs from that, but we don't have not
Yeah,
done
there's
that.
almost no incentive now.
No, there is no incentive at all, which is another reason why we are an outlier in the big wide OECD. It's we don't provide any savings at all. Bernard, I think he mentioned too, or someone mentioned about the fact that National scrapped the Kirk superannuation fund back in 1975. We've been paying for that since then. You just look across the ditch to Australia, where the
Yeah.
compulsory savings. Australia has it means tests its super, but they looking ahead. I think it's well built up to well over $1 trillion. The private saving balances there. And that means that the Australian government going forward has less of a problem with the demographics
Correct.
shift to an older population than we do. We are fortunately, because we have a bit of a churn and burn economy in terms of migration, we are also at the end where we have more manageable settings on this. But putting more money in early into superannuation, KiwiSaver, for the sooner that starts is better. It's
Yeah.
basic savings
I mean,
advice.
surely they should have made it tax deductible. But in fact, Bernard, you're busting again. As you
Yeah, that's right. Terry, I'm really curious about this investment boost tax break for businesses, which means that they can take 20% of the cost of an asset that they buy and they can claim that against their tax. What do you think about this?
It brings me back to my days when I was in the UK. We called this a first-year allowance. It's funny how your career seems to circle back to where you began. It's a good move, to be frank. It's actually surprisingly more generous than people realise. In that, because not only does it in plant and machinery, the obvious beneficiaries, people buying new kit, either new kit here, built here, or second-hand kit brought in. And I have a client for whom this is going to be very, very important because he's looking at refurbishing. This is going to be excellent news for him. It is a good move there. It goes broader than that because it can actually extend to certain buildings, new hotels, hospitals, and restaurants. Not bad, because I think sometimes when you look, tourism is important here, but you do look around, you think some of these facilities are a bit shabby, put it like that. And this is, I think, quite important. It would appear, based on the fact sheet, that earthquake strengthening expenditure could also qualify. So that is a tax issue of great import, because if at the moment, because the government removed depreciation on commercial buildings, then this question is earthquake strengthening a repair or capital? Repairs, deductible, capital, non-deductible becomes critical. This perhaps opens the door to enabling that some projects to move forward. So yes, I'm reasonably positive about this move.
And Nicola Willis presented this as, one of the solutions for increasing investment into our economy, increasing productivity, increasing growth, and was very keen to point out that Treasury had said this would increase the capital stock by 1.5% over 20 years and increase GDP by 1% over 20 years. In terms of, will this make a difference? Does it stick, if you like? Is this enough to really, change the dial on productivity and investment?
I'm not an economist, but I would say no, not enough. It's a good start. It's along the way. I think what we have to look at is we want higher wages, because higher wages drive higher productivity. If you have to hire someone at $30 an hour, you'll be wanting to make sure you maximize the productivity of that. But we seem perennially trapped in a willingness for a low wage, low productivity economy. The other thing that has to be done to that is, I've had this discussion before, it stuck with me quite some time ago, is our overinvestment in real estate. If
We
without the
never
capital
talk about
gains
that
tax,
here, Terry.
oh, I'm sure not at all. But let me tell you a wee story, about that. This which just
please
stuck
do.
with me. I'm a cyclist, and we were at a race, and I was chatting to someone. And his business had not done well, and he was yakking and saying, you get into this, and you want to do the best for your kids. You want to boost the ability so that he could send them to private schools. Perfect opportunity, aspirations for better for his children. And then he said, and obviously things may not go as well as he wanted. And then he said, but maybe it might have been easier if I just bought them all a house.
Yes.
And I think about that for myself, because I've been in business for 20 years now, building a business. I've employed people around there. I've tried to, I think it's 7 or 8 people, including myself. But it would have been easier for me 20 years ago to have just simply said, oh, I'll just go to the bank, borrow a heap load of money and buy up investment property. And I would be talking here now with you. I've had a much more enjoyable time of it. But
What?
that's
Yes,
the
you would. You'd be
incentive.
talking to us from the Bahamas.
Possibly. But the incentives there to build businesses, to grow businesses, it's hard yakka. And
Yeah.
the capital allocation is what's got to change. Now, I think this could help in that regard, because businesses are going to say, hey, look, I've got a 20%, I need to invest, I'm going to need to invest $1 million in new plant. Bank, yesterday might say, don't know about that, what equity have you got, what's the return? It turns up today, it says now that's effectively, let's say it's $1 million, that's going to cost me $720,000. The savings are quite as accurate as that. But the point is, he's now a more attractive prospect to the bank. So that perhaps unlocks some capital to be invested productively. One of the things I've just spoken to Aaron said about it, nothing for small businesses. There never is, because we don't have the minister's ears.
Well, she talked about trade. She talked about tradies.
Tradies, yes. You could argue that the thing about the investment boost is it's available to all companies. There's no restrictions on size. That is actually good, to be fair. But I'm thinking, repeating the point, but stressing the point I just made about finances. Obtaining finances for small businesses is tough, and the government doesn't seem to want to do much about it. The banks are very happy just to say, oh, well, investment property. They might even now say, oh, well, thanks to this now, how about commercial property? That's a bit of a better deal. I worry about that.
It still becomes a property market with an economy attached, as it were.
That's right, and I do worry about that, because I've been around long enough and I've seen investment opportunities like this been offered in the UK. And you sometimes wonder, do they turn it into a property play to minimize the risk and get the finance? I hope not. There is that risk.
Yeah, Terry, I was wondering, just when you see this budget overall, and it's a question I guess I could have asked Craig Rennie in a way, but he's a CTU person. Is this a budget to get us out of a self-inflicted recession, or is it just kind of going to keep us bumping along the bottom? Because as Bernard said, it was what was it, 1% increase in GDP over 10 years? But I mean the growth forecasts are pretty poor. This is not exactly a cattle prod into the bottom of the New Zealand steer, is it?
No, it's not. I don't think so, because I think there are fundamental issues that we need to address about productivity, about how we use migrants, and keeping our skills. As I said, Bernard talked about the churn of migrants. That was something I became concerned about when I was on the last government small business group council. I sort of realised, and we're next door to a very large economy in Australia, and the attraction of wages there is always going to be a pull. So we have to think very carefully about how we keep people here, what we can offer here. And I just don't see that. I don't see that in what's going on here.
Me neither.
We need to keep our skilled people here, because we're training them, and then we're basically saying, off you go to...
Terry, is the shortness of the electoral cycle a critical problem in this? Because she's talking. It's a little bit like those budgets you've seen sometimes where they never actually have to deliver the results of what the budget is because it's so far out and the electoral cycle is so short.
I don't think so, because you look at the British budgets for 5 years. The American budget, when the cycle they're talking about now is 10 years, they're talking about all those projections. I don't think so. Politicians will politic. I don't think the cycle perhaps lends itself to short-term solutions. I think the pay equity grab is a classic example. To me, this is a budget with a lot of financial engineering. It's like a CEO said, look, I've got to make the budget's next quarter's results look good. What can we do here? We shuffle stuff
I
around.
used to run an airline.
Yes. Yeah.
So Terry, just one more thing on the issues around working for families and Best Start. You've done some great work on, the tax system's relationship with welfare. There has been some nips and tucks there for Best Start and for working for families, but that still leave those very high marginal tax rates in place. What's your view on those changes to working for families and Best Start?
Short answer, not enough. Another smoke and mirrors. I did say this. I thought Sir Bill English was in the room. This was a Sir Bill English budget. The way that he would take money from KiwiSaver, which he did repeatedly, and then he'd play us a card here. He, for working for families, did this, increase the abatement rates. I wanted to ask the Minister of Finance about this question. The Treasury paper that said at the start of the year that 30% of all single parent families have an effective marginal tax rate of more than 50%. Didn't get the chance. This has changed nothing there.
Would you repeat that? Just repeat that, Terry, please.
According to a Treasury paper, 30% of all single parent families have an effective marginal tax rate of 50%, 50% or more. How do you get to that? Well, if you're earning $53,000 and you've got working for families, your tax rate is 30% on each dollar that you earn. You've got ACC that's going up by rate, I think it's 1.8%. And then your working for families is abated now at 27%. So you add all that up, you're already at 58.5%, 59%. And that's what happens. People do not appreciate that the highest taxed group of individuals in the economy are low-income earners.
Yeah, Bernard made that point at the start, but it's so interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, well, as I said, quickly, they found $154 million for property owners and New Zealand First Voters for the Super Gold card. Actually, not unfair to say that. I mean, that threshold is lifted to 45,000, so that's perfectly reasonable. It's falling there, but they found the money for that. They didn't say we're going to trim your super or put you on a super tax rate at all. They found the money for that. But could they find money for working families, the people who are earning the money to pay for superannuation now? No, they couldn't. Well, there's your priorities. I said, sorry, quite clear.
No, very well put, beautifully put, better put than Bernard in a sense. We can have you back for soliloquies. Bernard, go for it.
No, thank you very much, Terry, for coming on. I think your point about the marginal tax rates for people on working for families is really well made, and not a lot of people sort of understand it or think about it. And it's so counterintuitive for a government that talks a good game about reducing tax and making it creating good incentives for work. There is this dead zone in the middle, if you like, where people to get out the other side are having to go into a very deep hole of being enormously high taxpayers. And unfortunately, this budget didn't really solve that. Terry Boucher, thank you very much for coming on to win the.
Thanks, Terry. I'll come over and see you soon because I'm going to be, in trouble soon. Thank you.
Tanakwe.
See you.
Tanakwe, Peter. Tanakwe, Bernard. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Terry. Cheers.
Bernard, those were all great points actually, and I think Terry actually surprised me slightly with the identification of the holes in that budget. I don't know. This just we are in a dark. Nobody's addressing anything fundamental with this budget or with the last budget, other than maintaining a budget for plus 60 people to be relatively comfortable to look at housing investment. This is not the superannuation thing. I listened to your very good thing on one of your other podcasts about the Australian superannuation fund.
Yeah.
And I thought about Bill Rowling, and when I think about Bill Rowling, I always think of my uncle who was at school with him. So the best thing I could have done was smother Bill Rowling at Nelson Boys High in 1938. But
It's a bit mean.
yes,
But,
it is a bit mean. Well, he's no longer with us. But
I mean, but it is really one of those
Yeah.
what if lost opportunities in New Zealand history. Really,
Yeah.
it was in 1975. If we just left it there, we would now be sitting on relative
be
to
Norway.
GDP.
speaking of Norway, just
something like
before you set off on another soliloquy, one of the things that we were discussing today, before we came on with Catherine Dyer, was this. I think you said there's a tax concession now for greater or government support for greater gas drilling. Is that right? Gas exploration. Could you
Yeah.
just talk about that?
So Shane Jones was sitting on the top table during the lockup press conference, and he was pretty pleased because he managed to get $200 million out of the government, including about $180 million in capital for the government to co-invest in drilling for gas. So this is, a government which says that it's all about getting to net zero and is all about reducing emissions. But when it comes down to spending money, is spending $200 million, including, capital, to help private investors, to subsidise private investors to drill for more gas. Now, they would argue we need that gas to keep electricity prices down, but just imagine, how many solar panels and batteries we could buy with a couple of $100 million.
Yeah.
And the government is not looking to do that.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. And what else was in there about climate, Bernard? I mean, we saw this week, I think, that Todd Energy said it just wasn't going to be able to deliver on the carbon capture, which is, who knew, everybody. What else was in there on climate? Not to do Catherine's job for her, but it is important to think about how the government is planning. If we're planning 5 and 10 years out, what was in there about climate risk or anything? Was there anything?
No, and we keep forgetting, of course, that last year was the year that the climate fund, the money that's coming from the emissions trading scheme, was basically repurposed into tax cuts for landlords and for people on higher incomes. So that's still the case there. And of course, the government in the last year has, removed subsidies for electric cars, has put up the speed of people driving on motorways, which will increase.
Oh, I'm very
emissions.
grateful for that, actually. Yeah.
And has done a bunch of things to effectively increase emissions relative to the previous policies, and is using a Hail Mary piece of science in carbon capture, as well as a whole bunch of tree planting to achieve what they want. And luckily for the government, they're probably going to get away with it on a trade basis, because the European Union and the UK are a bit like the US, not quite as bad, but a bit like the US, dialing back on some of their green policies, simply because when you have a cost of living crisis, it's hard to get voters to care about
Anything
emissions
other than the
reduction.
price of butter, which of course is a reflection
Is
of the international
obscene.
price of butter. Bernard, may I ask you a couple of questions? I'm going to give you a little.
Sure.
I'm going to ask you a question, just 10 seconds, 5 seconds possibly, about your snapshot phrase to describe this budget. So just get your little thinking cap on, and also. Where are we going? There's some risks in the global economy that could knock all of this sideways, and I think actually we should get some, possibly the show after next, about the U.S. economy, the selling down of treasuries, China reducing its U.S. There's some very scary global economic things coming. Was this a good budget to prepare for that?
I don't think so. It hasn't made New Zealand more resilient. It's going to slow our economic growth. And actually, it doesn't take advantage of the opportunities being opened up by what we're seeing in a geopolitical sense. So you talk about Donald Trump and this reluctance now of foreign investors to start buying these US treasuries. For example, last night, we saw a very poorly received US 20-year Treasury bond auction, which increased the yield of the 30-year Treasury bond, which is very important because it's the basis for fixed mortgage rates in the United States. That rose above 5% for the first time since the global financial crisis. And in fact, it rose to levels that's last seen in 2007. And the risk for the United States is that its glorious privilege of being the world's reserve currency with reserve assets, so-called safe haven assets, particularly the US treasuries, if they had to lose that exorbitant privilege, then it makes it much harder for the US government to fund itself. But of course, what it does is that it means that all of those central
Everybody's
banks and
costs.
go
Sorry,
up.
Bernard.
Yeah, but it also means there is an opportunity for those people who want government bonds but can't or don't want to buy the US government bonds. Where are they going to go? They should be going to New Zealand to buy our government bonds. So there's an opportunity there. And also with the geopolitical stresses going on between the United States and China, we should be using that opportunity to buy panels and batteries and shipping containers full of batteries hand over fist at rock bottom prices to make ourselves more resilient, to reduce our costs of living and to reduce our current account deficit. But the government is not taking that opportunity, which I think they should. Instead, they have played the coalition games of giving ACT and New Zealand First what they wanted, being very opportunistic about the pay equity opportunity that Brooke Van Velden offered up. And this is what I can't quite work out about this budget. It's not a politically popular budget. They managed to alienate women. They've alienated young people. They've congratulated and compensated old people who are probably going to vote for them anyway. And they've made ACT voters happy who will never vote for Labor. So we haven't seen
Or for
any
National,
polls.
actually. This is the other thing.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
I suspect that ACT is the winner out of this.
Yeah. Now, whether that's a winner within a re-elected national government is difficult. And I'll be very interested to see the polls after this. You might recall that there was a brief slump in the polls after the last budget when the government got the cancer funding stuff wrong. And they had to backtrack on that at a rate of knots. And it will be interesting to see how the polls react to this budget, because I don't think it's a really politically popular, here's some money for me budget. And actually, there's only so long the government can say we're all about going for growth.
Yeah.
When actually the numbers say
they're not. Yeah,
lower
absolutely.
growth and more borrowing.
And what about debt, Bernard? I mean, because we in the 3 or 4, even 4 years we've been doing the podcast, you often talk about our debt ratio relative to the OECD and how, particularly when it was under Labor, that it wasn't in fact as, it wasn't crisis stations. What about our debt position?
So this has been a topic of hot debate in the last couple of days because Labor have wobbled on this bipartisan consensus that's been there for 30 years, which is that we shouldn't borrow too much in good times so that we've got this buffer for the bad times, for the earthquakes and the storms and the global financial crises. However, the limit, which depending on how you measure it, 50% of GDP is the accepted limit by National and Labor. The trouble is, it's very much based on early 1990s thinking and also based on pre-GFC and pre-COVID type of thinking about the power of bond vigilantes, what's happening with interest rates, and also New Zealand's vulnerability to being locked out of international markets. Unfortunately, Ian Rennie, who is the Treasury Secretary advising Nicola Willis, was an advisor to Jim Bolger in the first term of the national government from 1990 to 1993. His ideas were forged in those fires when New Zealand did have a foreign debt problem and did need to do something substantial to avoid credit rating downgrades. The early 90s really were the period when the bod vigilantes ruled okay, and James Carville was saying
Having
that
to
they were the
remind
most
Clinton. Yeah.
yeah, that they were the most powerful force on the universe and it's the economy stupid. Well, remember, our government is borrowing upwards of $40 billion a year without any trouble. Why? Because international investors, and remember those top 1% of the population, what is it they want when they've got even more money that they can deal with? They want to put it somewhere safe. And so they put it into government bonds. And also we have a bunch of banks and pension funds here who are forced to buy government bonds. And so I think that paranoia, that fear of debt growing below 50% is just that, paranoia. It's not based on actual research or what the bond markets or rating agencies are saying. They're saying, we'd be happy if you borrowed more. And actually, there's also an unidentified and silent deficit sitting underneath this, which isn't measured in these accounts.
So say what that is. Yeah.
That's the $200 billion of infrastructure deficit that we have accumulated over the last 20 years because we didn't borrow and we didn't invest in public infrastructure. Now, that's not taken into account when you worry about your 50% net debt, because what you're actually saying is, I'm not measuring the liabilities inherent in that $200 billion worth of infrastructure deficit. All I'm measuring is my net debt to GDP. And that's not a full picture of either the government's accounts or the society's accounts. Essentially, it ignores the future liabilities of our crumbling infrastructure and the issues we're going to have to deal with as our population keeps growing without the investment.
Bernard, what is the one sentence phrase, the headline about the budget from you?
This is the going for growth budget, the debt reducing budget that actually forecasts lower growth and higher debt.
Gosh, that's a very intelligent one, Bernard. That's more FT than Daily Mirror. Now, somebody wanted us to say, could we bring Patrick Smelly on so that we have a less reactionary response? And I don't quite. I think they possibly mean reactive. I don't know. Patrick has written. I mean, I quoted Patrick at the beginning of this. Patrick's written a very good piece about this, about stability and Patrick is writing for a business audience. I thought everything you've said is very progressive in the right way, right meaning of that word.
Yeah, I'd love to have
about who's
Patrick
actually
on.
affected. But we can have him on at some point. He's a wonderful man. He's a good friend of both of us. Now,
yes, skateboarding dogs.
Well, sort of skateboarding. Yes, okay. Well, I was also before the skateboarding dog. Let me just mention actually, it's about books. So. I spent quite a bit of time along with other elderly grey-haired people or boomer people at the Auckland Writers' Festival over the weekend. And a friend of mine said it looked like a Ryman's convention, a Ryman's retirement home convention, which I thought was extremely mean given that she's about the same age as me. And it was a record. I was astounded how many people were. I didn't realise there were that many pensioners in Auckland, and allegedly there were some young people as well. And I'm now 2/3 of the way tonight through the new Philippe Sands book, 38 Londra Street, which for those who've heard me talk about genocide from his book East West Street before, I couldn't recommend it enough. I think it's a little faster paced than East West Street, and he was brilliant. Colm Tobin was amazing. The Irish author, and I don't think I've read anything other than his non-fiction columns in the London Review of Books. Also saw an amazing video presentation from video interview with Susie from RNZ with Raja Shahada, who is an incredible writer and author from Ramallah in Palestine and in the West Bank. And I would, if the Auckland Writers' Festival has put it up, I would encourage people to look at that, to truly understand what a moderate, intelligent Palestinian, peace-oriented person says about the occupation. And then on the skateboarding dog, let me just, because I suspect poor old Simon might actually delete this, but anybody in Auckland, I thoroughly recommend, and I'm not a big comedy person, goes to see Barney Duncan performing a show called Ookie Pookie, which only old people will remember the phrase Ookie Pookie, at the Comedy Festival. It's on until Saturday night at the Basement Theatre. He's my cousin, so I have to full disclosure. But it is insane. It is Dadaism. It is way out there, and it's incredibly funny. All right, so that's my plug. The Skateboarding Dog is the Chicago Sun-Times and the Philadelphia Inquirer this week ran a sort of contributed supplement of the best guide to the best books of summer. And unfortunately, most of them don't exist because it was written with ChatGPT or some form of AI, and they basically don't exist. Yeah.
Well, it's absolutely enormously hilarious.
It's enormously funny, but it wasn't. Let's just be, it was a syndicated thing, but it's still absolutely ridiculous that it wasn't caught. But then the other day, because I listen to it every week, although I'm slightly infuriated by the new books editor of the New York Times, who said he was launching a podcast of their books of the summer, and he said, "Oh, I haven't read any of them," as if that was, I just thought, "Oh my God, why shouldn't I?" And I literally went, "Eh." Yeah. But anyway, I recommend 38 Londra Street by Philippe Sands as your read for the weekend.
Fantastic.
Oh, and What Do Israelis Fear About Palestinians by Raja Shahada.
That's wonderful.
Thanks, everybody.
Peter, lovely to you set it up nicely. The Sunday Star time, the Philadelphia Inquiry and the Chicago Sun-Times. AI after that a book festival. Wonderful.
Well, actually, do you know what we should do this week before the next Hoon? Is I might actually do this. Is get either Grok or AI, ChatGPT to make a Hoon for us, a little short 15-minute Hoon.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
I suspect Simon will cut that out, but
thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much. Ka kite anō.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Bernard.